Greetings, dear friends. Today in the АЛЛАТРА TV studio, we welcome the esteemed Igor Mikhailovich Danilov.
Greetings.
Igor Mikhailovich, with great joy, I would like to pass on to you the words of gratitude from our viewers for the previous video, and especially for the spiritual gift that was in that video, for that wonderful feeling of really true joy and true kinship that overfilled the heart of every person, of each of our viewers, for that wonderful surge of inner love, which was so intense, so abundant, that it seemed that the whole space was just radiating with this light of love. You know, it is very difficult to describe this experience through consciousness, and it's very difficult to understand this experience with the mind, because consciousness doesn't understand the nature of the spiritual world. While what can be said here? Sometimes consciousness very poorly understands even some aspects of material life. It poorly knows the structure of the universe and the world around us. And the most unfortunate thing is that sometimes a person poorly knows even his own nature. In the previous video, you touched on an interesting point. You said that consciousness is constantly clinging to the question, what was there before God? How did God appear and originate? And so our viewers said that this is really so, that consciousness understands that there is this three-dimensional world, there is the universe, which is finite, and behind it, yes, it seems like there is God somewhere. But everyone still had these questions. What is there beyond the reality of God? How did God appear and originate?
Well, let's start with a simple thing. There can be nothing beyond the reality of God. The spiritual world is boundless and infinite. Yes, our consciousness doesn't perceive that. We are very limited by the boundaries of our world, and our consciousness cannot go farther than our universe. It doesn't perceive that. We hardly even comprehend in our heads what our universe is. Yes, we can arrange something in imagination that many galaxies are far away from each other, but it is still a finite world. It is limited by the presence of matter. While what is beyond our universe,
Yes.
we cannot imagine. But again, just look, it's interesting how our consciousness works. It immediately asks the question, what is beyond God's world?
Right.
If there is the infinite, boundless world of God, which is everywhere and anywhere, then there has to be something beyond it anyway. Well, how, if it is infinite and it's everywhere, we still try to limit the infinity of God's world with our mind? And therein lies, of course, the limitedness of our consciousness. Even more so, we understand, we realize that our universe is material. It came into being, and it will end. Sooner or later, everything will end.
Yes.
And that's where we draw the analogy, subconsciously, without even wanting to. But the question we have is, what was there before the world of God? If there is God, God's world, hence it once appeared, didn't it? Well, if it once appeared, it is quite logical that it will end someday. We do not perceive that God's world is infinite and it is eternal. It has always been there. It is there and it will always be there. Our universe exists for just a very brief moment compared to the boundlessness and infinity of God's world. Well, it seems to me that this paradox arises in our consciousness precisely because we do not understand what God's world really is. I'll try to explain, my friends, because the question is actually serious and it is very foolishly answered in different ways in many religious organizations. Why? People encounter, but having no knowledge, having no experience, and having forgotten what was known in the past, they now try to interpret from the mind, or they refer to the fact that God has always been, therefore He's eternal. But there is such a concept. I'll try to explain it so that it can be understood with our mind. Why is God's world eternal? And it has always been. And why is any material universe, I emphasize, any universe, including ours, limited and temporary? Let's look at how our universe is organized. It is dynamic. We have nothing, nothing at all. Not a single particle, not a single manifestation of energy, not a single wave that doesn't move.
In motion.
We are constantly in motion. And this motion generates time. Or time generates motion. It doesn't matter here. You can argue for a long time on this fact too. But it's a combination. Motion and time. Since there is time, everything will be finite. Since there is motion, it will stop someday. That is, the energy which sets this momentum of motion runs out and everything ceases to exist. And all these compactions of energy disintegrate. Why do I say compactions of energy? Because if we go deeper into the world, into the micro-world, into our micro-world, beyond the quantum limit, from particles we will come to energy, to a wave. Meanwhile, a wave is also, made up of something. And what it is made of also has specific characteristics. So far, it's all just words to us. Although in ancient times it was known, and in ancient times it was described, and we can now find historical evidence that thousands of years ago the structure of the world was described at the micro level, something that we are only now getting to.
Yes.
We don't know yet what the quantum world is. We don't know the laws of the quantum world. We are just guessing. The only observation that we have made, and until now we cannot understand the cause, is the interaction of entangled particles, that they paradoxically behave contrary to the logic of our physics, let's put it this way. Well, the physics of microparticles is totally different, while that which is beyond them is radically different even from that micro-world. Yet, what is the spiritual world, which is outside the universe? It is static. There is no motion in it. And that's where our consciousness cannot perceive this either. How is it? There is life, and a very, let's say, dynamic life. Why? Because in God's world, there is always joy, there is always a mass of colors. How do we perceive colors? We perceive colors, hues and light,
Yes.
as a certain motion, right? So we have...
Life is always motion for consciousness, right?
Of course. And light, isn't it motion? Light cannot be stopped.
Right.
We cannot create conditions under which light would stop. We can slow it down under special conditions, but we cannot stop it. Although I should say some experiments are conducted nowadays. When motion is decelerated, there are special temperatures, a special gas. Well, it's all quite complicated, and the speed of light is slowed down under these conditions. However, the experiment itself is conducted on our planet, which is moving along with the solar system. The planet is moving in the solar system along with the galaxy. It is still a motion, it's a tremendous motion if we go deeper into the micro-world. Velocities are enormous there. So these velocities, enormous velocities at which microparticles move, actually determine finiteness and create time, but they also generate what we call gravitation, that is, interaction of microparticles. After all, interaction of macro objects doesn't create gravitation. Gravitation is generated at the micro level.
At the micro level.
Yes, but we're not going to bring up the topic of gravitation today. It's an interesting topic, of course, but not for today. I hope now it will be clear at least a little bit. Though, again, our friends will say, it is totally unclear. Our material world is motion,
Yes, yes.
while the spiritual world is
Statics, right.
absolute statics.
You have noted correctly that consciousness really understands that life is motion. So for it, even in the spiritual aspect, what does one need to do? To constantly achieve some goals to move along the spiritual path.
Right.
It seems to consciousness that everything
course.
outside dynamics is somehow perhaps boring or...
Well, consciousness doesn't perceive that.
Right.
Why? We must conquer the spiritual world, that is, we must defend it.
move towards some goal, attain this love.
Right. And what does this cause? It causes the emergence of so-called holy places. It gives rise to a desire coming from our consciousness, due to the dynamic nature of our world, to move towards these holy places. Supposedly there are some energies there that will give us whom? Will they give energy to our body?
An extra surge of some kind.
This happens, we don't argue. But holy places are where there is the highest amount of primary energy of Allah.
Concentration of it.
And this is not necessarily tied to some places that once had it, and where there is increased concentration of these powers, as you say. Well, such things exist too, but that's not the point. If you are not ready to perceive that, then wherever you are, you won't perceive it, and it definitely won't help you spiritually in any way. However, if a person is really focused on spiritual development, if he strives, complies with, let's say, the first foundations, well, the first foundation on the spiritual path is what? The power of attention, right?
Right, where you invest the power of attention.
That is to distribute it properly. Where you invest it, that's what it generates.
That's what is multiplied.
If you come to some places or communicate with someone who has these powers in excess, who himself radiates these powers, you feel this. All people feel it. Even atheists feel. They call it differently. They perceive it differently, but the fact remains, a person feels this. Where does he spend this power afterwards, even after receiving it? On matter. In other words, this power goes into magic. If we have received some additional powers, it means we can do something. And that's where consciousness immediately says, come on, dream, think, invest, and obtain, right? Hence the deception, not spiritual liberation, not true love, not striving for the spiritual world, but trivial material things, health, wealth, or something else. Everything is very simple. That's how our consciousness is arranged. Again, going back to the static nature of the spiritual world, our consciousness doesn't perceive that. Why? Since it is static, it doesn't move anywhere at all. But the point is that the spiritual world cannot move anywhere in any place or direction. It is everywhere and anywhere. And universes like ours are multiple in the spiritual world. And they are all dynamic inside. Yet, they are nothing compared to the spiritual world. It has nowhere to move. It is eternal.
You've mentioned multiple universes. It's just that this topic of multiverse, let's say, has been stirring people's minds for a long time. Although in today's world, due to the fact that there is a lot of science fiction and movies based on it,
well, people try to explain.
They understand it in a different way, that these are some kinds of alternative realities with the same characters and so on.
Right, I'll explain it simpler to our friends. The theory of the multiverse implies that multiple universes which originated in one point exist in parallel. This is really so. Even in this territory, in the space where our universe is located, there are a lot of parallel universes. A different frequency. That's it. I mean, the fundamental frequency. We'll return to that. What are multiple multiverses in modern understanding? According to our modern understanding, our universe originated from one point. There is matter, there is antimatter, there is a different frequency of vibrations and interactions, and they just don't mix, but everything occurs sort of in parallel with a slight deviation. In other words, in parallel to this universe based on modern theories of the multiverse, there is also Tatiana everywhere. Let's say there are dozens of these universes and dozens of Tatianas in these universes. In our universe, in our three-dimensional reality, Tatiana is sitting here asking me questions, and we are talking with her and with you. Whereas somewhere in a parallel universe is the other way around. Tatiana is sitting here, I'm asking her questions, and she's answering.
Or she's sitting behind the camera.
Or she's sitting behind the camera, or she's busy with something somewhere, while somewhere else she hasn't arrived yet.
Right.
That is a multitude, yet it is still Tatiana everywhere. It's very funny and silly. Why? Because there is such a notion as individuality. That's impossible. There are universes and they develop in parallel, but I'll put it this way, not only people are not alike, even galaxies are not alike. Yes, there are various forms of life. The laws are approximately the same. There is spiral development. Well, everything develops according to the same patterns, but even galaxies are not similar to one another. You know, I'll give you an example. For understanding, it is very simple. We take a black background, a speed camera, and a spoon of dry flour. We toss it and shoot on the speed camera. We will toss the spoon 1,000,000 times. and a million times we will have a completely different picture. That is, the flower when falling down, the suspended material will produce a completely different pattern. Whether we toss it a million times or a billion times, we will never achieve absolute sameness. That's the essence of multiverses. Yes, they are multiple. Yes, they exist. No one denies that. And in fact, we can already prove some things experimentally. But they have their own life. And now a question arises. How can a lot of universes originate in one and the same point?
Several universes.
Right. Just to make it clear, everything depends on the fundamental vibration.
Resonance.
Absolutely right. In other words, what is this universal resonance or fundamental vibration, universal vibration? It is what works at a certain frequency. Meanwhile, our entire matter feeds on one energy. The entire universe consists of one energy. I understand there are numerous questions now. No, we have a great number of emanations that originate from this kind of energy, which has begotten everything, and everything is created upon it, and thanks to it, everything exists. Only afterwards, a variety of those kinds of energies appears, and this variety produces completely different resonance. Therefore, each of us has his or her own shape. If we look at the micro level of our DNA and RNA as an information structure, we will see the difference in resonance, not only the position of proteins and molecules, but we see the difference even in that very resonance of interaction in our DNA, say, of my body and Tatiana's body. They will work at their own frequencies. They will resonate with each other, but they will never work jointly. Why? We would not be even able to create conditions for her DNA and my DNA to work in one resonance, otherwise they would mix. This is very simple, but if we look at what is located much deeper, beyond the quantum limit, we will come to that energy which works at the universal frequency, that is, we will come to the universal resonance. It was called in different ways, but from time immemorial it has been called the powers of Alat. In other words, a single drop of Alat begets our entire universe. So this point is partially true, that the universe emerged from one point.
The Big Bang Theory, yes.
Right, Big Bang Theory.
It's an echo.
Or manifestation of matter from nothing, but it is finite, and it doesn't stop and doesn't compress later on to
a point.
One point, yes. Matter cannot be
compacted to a point
to such an extent that it would compress, although they try to say that, and it is sort of more logical for our mind. Yet those who support this theory cannot explain how a mass of material objects, huge ones, well, excuse me, let's not go far, let's take a neutron star. For those who understand what a neutron star is and what its density is, or let's take a black hole and how compacted it is in the understanding of modern physics, and what the volume of the core of even the most massive black hole is. Is it actually equal to a point? A simple question, of course not. We see the volume, we understand how huge a black hole is, although its density is very high. Let's say it should be high, theoretically, even in the understanding of modern physics, and it is almost impossible to compress the entire matter into one point.
It would disappear.
Of course, matter would disappear. Matter is actually a manifestation. That's what I'm saying. The trouble is also that we don't have appropriate equipment that would enable us to look beyond the quantum limit. And there is also a question, where did the ancients know about this from? They actually described it, what is there, and how it is generated from a single drop, brought from the spiritual world and turns into a fantasy. Well, that's really a fantasy. What is our territory? These are merely thoughts from the spiritual world, meaning a point where attention was invested. Thus, such an entire universe of ours emerged, and in parallel with it, a mass of other universes emerge. Now, I will explain, because we will digress and forget it later.
Okay.
What does the universal resonance of our entire matter mean? Again, all more or less big objects start having different resonances. All manifestations, even at the level of energy, those energies which originate from Alat, already start having their own frequencies. amplitudes, and so on. For understanding, let's take, well, if you're at home, my friends, or in the office, just look around. Let's suppose there is a refrigerator, a microwave oven, electrical appliances,
Toasters, coffee machines, yes.
toasters, coffee machines, and everything imaginable. All of them work at their resonances.
Right, each has its function, that is, individually.
Each has its function. Each generates some energy in its own way, thermal energy, or on the contrary, cold, vibrates in its own way, occupies a certain volume in its own way, and they somehow interact with each other. I mean, these are totally different devices, right? But if we look at what they work on the same electrical energy. The entire electrical energy which feeds all this has a certain frequency, a certain number of kilohertz, a certain voltage, a certain amperage, and everything else, right?
Right.
So they come from one source and perform a certain function, but all of them are different in their own way.
In the same way, the material world is formed.
In the same way, the material world is formed, depending on information, on a program. Either a stone is created,
From one energy.
or, pardon me, a human, and everyone performs their function.
Without this electrical energy, all this equipment is junk.
No, there is a difference here. If we turn off electricity in the office or at home, as you say, all this hardware becomes just cabinets, boxes, and vessels. And it occupies space, it will not be functional.
Function.
Whereas if we turn off a lot, the entire matter will simply disappear. You know, it's like turning off a hologram, and there is just emptiness. But in this case, if it relates to our universe, there will be even no emptiness. Everything simply disappears, and there is the world of God again. This is like an inclusion in the spiritual world.
Also, you've just mentioned a hologram. There is another interesting theory. In the last century, one of the physicists made an assumption that all of us, people, collectively form our reality. In other words, there is a manifested world. It's the world where we sense everything, our physical world, and there is a subtle world. It's a unified consciousness and potential. So, in the same way as we let a laser beam pass through a film and it forms an image, a hologram, in the same way, we, all people, let this collective energy pass through human consciousness like through a film, and it creates a hologram, meaning our physical reality. Is this actually true?
That's pridefulness. Let me explain. If, let's say, we as observers observe energy, it can become matter. Well, there are physical experiments. Hence, our observation forms matter, right? And here, our demons in the head, so to say, elevate us to the greatness of God that thanks to us, the entire universe is formed. Yet when we didn't exist, didn't the universe actually exist? Hence, we will elaborate this theory. Other people existed on other planets, they formed it. But how did everything emerge before planets appeared? How was it created?
Oh, Igor Mikhailovich, people have such interesting points of view that since we are recently created people and our universe is relatively young, then what did God actually do before the creation of the world, since he had so much time?
Well, he had nothing to do, right? So what was he doing?
Consciousness doesn't understand that
The universe is young. Before this time there was nothing, and there was only...
We're relatively recently...
Now, our universe has appeared, and he has something to do. Keep an eye on everyone, compile books of life, write our schedules, take care of everyone.
Take care, yes, so that God takes care of them.
But when we didn't exist, what did he do? Well, friends, don't you have thoughts like that? You do. Let's go back to that man.
Pridefulness.
I think this is also an interesting question. Let's deal with it a little later. So, that fellow who suggested that we form the universe is partially right. But he himself doesn't even know why he is right and what he is right about. He is right as personality, but not as consciousness. And of course, this inner feeling, this inner understanding that we, as humans, contribute to the formation of the universe, of all matter in general, it comes from the fact that in each of us there is an inclusion from the spiritual world. There is a soul and there is a personality as a reflection. All this is located in, let's say, for understanding in the higher dimensions of our material world, but it is in the material world. And since there is a part of the spiritual world in us, it is natural that this part participated in the creation of this world. So, let's say if you're doing something, for example, frying
Okay.
or baking pies, are you involved in that process? Every cell, every energy in your body is involved in that process. It doesn't matter whether you are baking pies or creating a universe. Your whole body is involved in that. And if a part of your body gets into that product you have created, why? Because it won't be created without you, and you are the one who sustains it. Well, if we already refer to the relationship between the spiritual world and our material universe, without that which is life, life cannot originate in anything. That is, there can be nothing that would simply exist and generate life. No, life originates from life. A question, temporary or permanent life? And there is a huge difference here. Why? Because the spiritual world is eternal. Everything in it is eternal. It is static. It is there. But it's different all the time. There is no instant where one instant would repeat another in the spiritual world. There is no such thing, even in our understanding. Well, first of all, an instant doesn't exist there. Secondly, there is constant diversity, but in our understanding, diversity is dynamics. In our understanding, eternal love would be boring. Well, you have to agree that permanent joy, happiness, love, our consciousness will not understand this. It will say, it's impossible, it would be very boring. Isn't it so?
It is.
That brings our consciousness into some kind of sadness. How can this be? But when a person embarks on the spiritual path and when he really, truly receives a response from the spiritual world, he realizes that every moment of communication with the eternal world is so precious and beautiful, and those who have more practice and are really able to be in an uninterrupted relationship with the spiritual world, well, somehow no one has yet said that it is tedious, right? While consciousness of a person who has no practical experience of communicating with the spiritual world, who doesn't live by it, his consciousness exactly creates such obstacles and dead ends. People say, come on, it's against static, it's against love. How do we perceive love? To make love. To love someone, but as for loving someone, it means that someone must obey you and do what you want. Isn't that so? We don't know how to love. We people, what we call love, we elevate it, either to some kind of responsibility or to consumerism. That's what our whole relationship is based upon. We either must receive something or we are forced to give something. And love is affection. Excuse me, we even have love for animals, don't we? How can there be love for a material object? For instance, a simple expression, I love my car, but this expression comes from the mind. It is dear to you, you've collected the last money, all that you have earned in your whole life, you've bought yourself a car, and now you value it as your own life. Well, there are such people.
All your attention is in it, yes. You have put your life into it.
Yes, meaning there,
Right.
I said it in the full sense. You have put your whole life into this car, in other words, all your attention, whereas attention is our life. And instead of God's love, you acquired a car. It is temporary, and consciousness understands that, but it doesn't understand how you can gain the eternal, how you can gain that love which begets life. Life is constant diversity, it is happiness in dynamics, but it is static. You see, there is a paradox here of dynamics and statics. After all, it is diverse, so it is dynamic, but it is always static. It's impossible to comprehend that. I'll give you another simple example for understanding because I realize that we've raised a topic which will simply drive people into a deadlock a little bit because they try to figure it out with their mind.
If they are guided by consciousness, then yes.
Of course. Those who are not guided by consciousness, they feel it, understand, and don't ask such questions. They don't need them because they know the answers themselves, while those who are looking for answers,
Yes.
they are searching. I'll give a simple example. There is no movement in the spiritual world. That is, a person cannot get from point A to point B by moving. Here, in order to get, let's say, from one to cross a road, from one side of the street to the other. You have to make a lot of energy-consuming movements. You need to cross. In the spiritual world, you can be everywhere simultaneously. Simultaneously everywhere. You can be at the point where you need to be. You don't move. That's where the paradox is. If we are forced to move through space here, there is no space over there. For understanding, space is a bounded volume. That is, whatever and wherever it would be, it is bounded, while there are no boundaries. No matter where you want to be, you are there, because you want to be or you need to be. And that's it. That's an incorrect example. I emphasize, this is not so, but it's for understanding. For instance, you are on our planet, right where you are now, but you need to get to Mars. Well, you don't have money. Elon Musk is not your friend. The chances are zero. But if you possess certain skills, all you have to do is move there, let's say mentally. And here's the paradox. For us, here, to even move, I mean astral projection, we have to move from here to there. And now imagine, again, those who actually have enough spiritual experience understand what I'm saying now. Well, for people who still live by the logic of the mind, I will explain by giving the following example. You need to get from our planet Earth, from the point where you are, to a certain point on Mars. This point approaches you. Not you approach it, but it approaches you. And the difference is huge. But still here, why is this an incorrect example? Because there's movement of something somewhere. While there, in the spiritual world, well, it's really very hard to express it. This happens. I mean, you are everywhere. You are everywhere simultaneously, but you are where you want or where you need to be. In other words, there is no locomotion, no movement. There is omnipresence. So from this explanation, a notion appeared that God is omnipresent. And a human, as an angelic creation, for example, who has entered the spiritual world as part of that world, or speaking the language of religion, if he enters paradise, he is simultaneously everywhere and anywhere, but dwelling in paradise described by the priests. I mean the later times, when religion already became an instrument, an organization, everything was actually distorted there, and even the knowledge which existed before that time was distorted. Even the descriptions of paradise
Sky.
are the same three-dimensionality.
Yes, some kind of sky where...
Not only that, people live, exist, they exist in matter, they interact, they walk, they communicate, they talk, which is again a description of our three-dimensionality.
They move to another plane, right?
Yes, simply where they don't get sick, don't grow old, where they always feel good and peaceful.
All dreams come true, everything they dreamed about here.
And dreams come true, magic, sheer magic, yes. But again, in the body, why? Because people couldn't separate themselves from their consciousness. They couldn't imagine anything different, they had no experience, and had no spiritual knowledge. In reality, they didn't have spiritual liberation as such, but there was actually enslavement of them as personalities by their consciousness. So the following dictation came from consciousness. What is hell? You suffer in the body, that is, your bones creak, your teeth chatter, and so on. Well, that's already later times when the spiritual experience was lost. Well, before that, even excuse me, what we now call modern civilization, there were 6,000 years when people existed and had the skill. When in fact, yes, people were born here, but they became angels and almost everyone, with a rare exception, departed. They delighted the spiritual world.
Igor Mikhailovich, when a person is in love, this state can be described as a kind of expansion. Yet, does the spiritual world expand?
It has nowhere to expand.
Does it enlarge? These are the questions that people ask.
It cannot enlarge, and there is a paradox here. Well, it's again hard to express it in our words. Why? Angels come to the spiritual world constantly, every moment. Why? There's a mass of universes. There's a great number of them. where, let's say, each universe contains a mass of other universes, that is, parallel universes or multiverses. And so angels come from everywhere,
Inflow.
all the time. It's a huge constant inflow which has always been and will always be, and it is present today. And even from this, by logical thinking, we come to an understanding if there is a constant inflow of a huge number of angels into the spiritual world, it's a huge number which is constantly, which actually gives joy to the spiritual world. And the spiritual world is constantly in joy from the manifestation and arrival of more and more new angels. That is, it's a constant renewal, hence it must continually expand. Guys, this is not China. And this is not India, where the more people, the more territory is needed. Understand it correctly, this is not a game of sublimation. Again, I'll explain why. Because everything that comes into the spiritual world has actually come out of it, but it's a different form. The imperfect becomes perfect. In the spiritual world, there is nothing imperfect. The spiritual world creates the imperfect, our universe, with a mass of, let's say, people of various species. But human-like, what does human-like mean? It means soul-filled. But where there is also consciousness for counterbalance, and when personality wins, the energy becomes the energy of Allah, I emphasize, that which generates all life. This inclusion of the soul is nothing but pure energy, pure, I emphasize. And on its basis, personality is born. And to counterbalance personality, secondary consciousness is created. It's all in three-dimensionality. Be it one floor higher or one floor lower, doesn't matter. There are various universes, but an angel, that is, an individual, a part of the spiritual world is being born. Thus, out of the inclusion of energy, out of our attention, there emerges what is similar to us. I think hardly many people will understand what this is and how valuable it is, but it is very valuable. So, no matter how you slice it, the spiritual world can neither shrink nor expand, because everything that is generated in it is generated by the spiritual world itself, yet it is constantly renewed. There is nothing there that can grow old and somehow disappear or be destroyed, no. And it has nowhere to expand, it is everywhere, but our concept of everywhere will be still limited by our mind. That is, no matter how vast the territory is. And again, where is this territory? And the territory itself implies some kind of limitation. If the spiritual world is infinite, in what and where is it infinite? It is infinite in itself.
Yes, consciousness always needs some coordinates.
100%. And here we see the artificiality of our consciousness. That's for smart people, for those who are able to analyze, those who have taught their consciousness to submit at least a little bit and execute what a person wants as personality, the one who possesses the freedom of personality at least a little bit. Of course, if a person is completely under the dictatorship of consciousness, he will deny all this. He's unable to analyze, he's unable, from the position of observer, in the highest sense, to observe those flows which take place in consciousness. Such a person is unable to control his consciousness. Consciousness manipulates him, and it will deny this information, whether you want it or not, friends. But if a person possesses at least some freedom, at least some experience of observation, he can look at his consciousness and he will understand that our consciousness is limited in its functions. It cannot perceive either volume or area or anything else without coordinate points. That's it. And this is one of the most fundamental proofs of the artificiality of our consciousness. We do not perceive and cannot perceive anything without correlating or comparing it with something. In other words, we should have something interacting with something else. If we try to describe, well, I don't know, a cloud in the sky, we have to correlate it with the earth, with other clouds, with stars or something else. We will not understand where this cloud is located if we don't have other coordinates relative to this observed object or that point. This is the limitedness of our thinking. Well, that's how it was created, and unfortunately, it works and functions in the same way in everyone. It's just that in someone it is more developed, while in someone else it is less developed. Everything depends again on the power of attention which was invested in consciousness since the very beginning, as well as on physiological particularities, of course.
Igor Mikhailovich, there is also such an interesting point. I would also like to touch upon the subject of near-death experiences. I remember a story of one physicist who actually survived clinical death, and being in the near-death state, he decided to explore the space where he found himself, as he believes, to explore the other world. So he describes what happened to him. Of course, according to classics, he was flying along a tunnel when suddenly he understood that he wanted to somehow slow down this flight, and he succeeded in that. He wanted to change the direction of the flight, and he managed to. In other words, space and time were changing in some way. For instance, he wanted to recall an old broken TV set, and he recalled everything about it. That is, all the cause and effect relations lined up, what was broken in that TV set, when it was made, including what steel it was made of, which steel worker welded it, and what was the steel worker's life story. What is actually this state? After all, there, a certain change both in time and space sort of occurs as well, and you kind of know, a person gains sort of omniscience.
Let's say this person didn't have an after-death experience. It's just that when his body stopped functioning while it was being resuscitated, he was lucky in the sense that his personality managed to get into the so-called tunneling effect, that is, to get through his back essence into the tunnel. For many people it will be unclear, but I'll try to explain. It's quite a natural physical process. It is due to the peculiarities of the energy structure of a human himself, what we call the back essence, or in the past it was called chakrans, gates, or whatnot. All this is an attempt to describe the energy structure of our body. A human body, that's already indisputable, friends, has a material base and an energy base. Nothing can exist without that. There are lots of examples and studies. You cannot argue here anymore. So, a human, as personality, can control his energy structure as well. Let's say there exist certain techniques for a person to go through and gain experience in his subconsciousness, as they say. Yet, what is subconsciousness? Subconsciousness is precisely what we call the back essence, that is, an energy center which stores our information. It is where there is partially both our consciousness is connected with that secondary consciousness, I emphasize, not primary one, and certain capabilities of a slightly different level are associated with this very center. What does a slightly different level mean? Well, it is one dimension higher, where our consciousness is located. For example, a person wants to learn astral projection. There are lots of various techniques, methods, and so on. 99.9% of them cause activation of fantasy from secondary consciousness. In other words, a person invests his attention in a desired object, and secondary consciousness draws cartoons and hallucinations for him. In reality, a person doesn't move anywhere, he simply watches it as a dream. Some people really perceive all this as an accomplished fact. However, it radically differs from reality. Yet there are people who really have an ability,
Such an experience and ability.
an experience of astral travel. But all of them go through very specific practices. I mean, otherwise you will not learn. In order to get away from fantasies and the mind, say, if we now open social media, for example, for those who practice astral projection, it's enough to listen to those people, and it's immediately clear that these are merely hallucinations, merely fantasies. Whereas if a person really performs an astral projection, he can even slightly move objects. He can really be there. As long as he is there, you can talk to him, and he will tell you everything he sees and everything he knows, but it will be his body that will speak here, while he will be far away there, no matter where we send him. Yet, again, when a person returns, he doesn't remember most of his experience. However, those who engage in fantasies,
Remember everything.
as a rule, remember everything like a dream, in colors and the like. Plus, they cannot affect objects, and in fact, they cannot really describe that. For instance, if they get into an unfamiliar place, they will never describe it. Consciousness will fantasize for them what it can fantasize, but it won't describe it for real. Whereas if a person indeed performs an astral projection, he will describe everything in that point just as it is, as if you enter there and look. And he can move, travel, and look at it all. So, why I have told you all this, my friends? The tunneling practice is a practice which is exactly based on learning astral projections too. Well, I don't know who needs it. Let's say on the spiritual path, this is needed for some people as working techniques. Well, depending on the purpose, the spiritual path also has various routes. There is a spiritual path solely for salvation of one's soul, but there is also service to the spiritual world. These are different things. And those who really intend not just to become spiritually liberated, but to benefit the spiritual world, even in this world, they do need such practices. So one of the practices is the so-called tunneling. It was also mentioned in antiquity, in extremely remote antiquity. And what does it give? It gives this very effect described by this scientist. Indeed, a person gains a certain freedom there, and he can move, but notice, not something moves towards him, as we earlier spoke about the spiritual world.
Yes, in the spiritual world.
But he moves. Yet he really possesses a certain freedom, a freedom of thinking. For example, this scientist has identified that the transistor is broken in the TV set. And where and what should be done? Why? Because all the knowledge he acquired expands and starts working quite synchronously. Thus, indeed, a person gains greater opportunities, but they are still limited. For instance, if you don't know, let's say, the Hungarian language. Do you know Hungarian?
No, I don't.
You don't. So, if you perform tunneling even 1,000 times, you won't learn it. This would not give you the skill which is not embedded in you. However, if you learned this language, but it was difficult for you, yet you spent and invested a lot of attention, there you would speak it fluently. Why? Because memory works there without failure. There, cause and effect relations, as you say, all immediately line up. Well, here there is also a fantasy, so this fantasist, he is a fantasist. What he said that he knew, which steelworker well did that,
Yes.
and that he had problems with his mother-in-law, this already indicates a fantasy or an intentional lie. He may have gained some experience, but later on, when telling about it,
Consciousness added something.
he wanted more and more and more, overblown megalomania.
He wanted novelty.
Moreover, he was a serious researcher, he dealt with rocket weapons and many other things. So naturally, he wanted to exalt himself somehow more and more. That's already a mischief of being clever, as they say. So he already added details.
So that the story wouldn't be repetitive.
Right, well, he may have acquired experience because, based on what he described, there was indeed an effect, and he was really there, and really had capabilities. And as he admitted afterwards, he embedded in his work some insights which he had acquired there, and this was indeed reflected.
He implemented them.
Yes, it was implemented in that very rocket building. They gained super abilities there, thanks to his tunneling experience. Well, guys, I'll give a simple example. There was a spiritual school where a lot of people were trained, but there were two boys in it who strove not for the spiritual world, but for glory and honor. Both of them were too selfish. They possessed practices and already understood that, yes, there is experience, there is another world, there are different dimensions. They were aware of all that. Why? Because they underwent training. However, selfishness prevailed over them. And both of them quit that school exactly at the point of experiencing communication, let's say, with themselves and, let's say, with the Absolute, meaning with the information field. Or to put it simply, tunneling. The tunneling effect, where you can manipulate your consciousness in a way impossible in real life. So, having acquired a skill, they realized that thanks to that, they could become head and shoulders above everyone. It opened up tremendous opportunities for them in three-dimensionality, sort of to become kings. Both of them wanted to become famous, both wanted glory. One of them was Bartini, the other one was Tesla. We know how they ended up. They did go far, yes, they surpassed everyone in science, yes, they used this skill as a tool. As for Bartini, he had a totally miserable life, although he excelled, he looked far ahead and created those airplanes which are only acceptable today. I mean his designs. Whereas if we look at Tesla, what did he strive for? For glory, money, and everything else, yes. He invested knowledge, he used his consciousness 100% and made a lot of discoveries, the greatest discoveries. But what was the point? To help people? Was it a sincere service, at least to humanity? No. It was a pursuit of glory. And we can see by simple examples that as soon as he received at least a penny, he would spend it on luxury right away. He wanted a happy life and wealth. So how did he end up and how did he live? That's the payment for stupidity. Well, they were on the threshold of getting to know something greater. Although, you know, humanity as a civilization benefits from such people. They advance progress and bring here discoveries that later on facilitate our lives. That's also good, but they pay with their lives for that. That's bad.
Igor Mikhailovich,
Although one thing didn't hinder the other.
here such an interesting point arises too. After all, when people describe their experiences, let's say, of being in this near-death state, they say that they sort of experienced this sense of flight before, that it's an effect of what they already saw.
Déjà vu effect.
Right, kind of a déjà vu effect.
Of course, 100%.
Some people think that maybe it is reincarnation of the soul. Supposedly you already had this experience of dying several times, and this actually relates to that. Is this true?
It's not the experience of previous personalities, of the current subpersonalities which are inside a person himself. No, it's the experience of personality. Because a human as personality has actually been in this state, and the tunneling effect is present for some fractions of an instant, at the moment of waking up, at the moment of falling asleep. In other words, let's disclose a little secret. The moment of personality's disconnection from consciousness takes place approximately by this scenario, meaning through the back essence. And a person has this experience, any person, but you won't be able to catch this state just like that. This is physics, so to say. And in order to reach it, to control this process and to stay in it, you have to spend time, effort, and attention, sometimes years, to learn that. While this déjà vu effect certainly exists, if a person gets into this state, he surely has this experience. Everyone has it. Let's just take what is called déjà vu. When several people meet, and a person knows what will happen in a moment, that someone is supposed to approach now and ask something, and he's sort of shocked, how come, what is it? Again, as you say, this is reincarnation and everything flows according to the same scenario. Everything is looped and we run around like a hamster on a wheel, right?
Or you get into some kind of an alternative reality, yes.
Yes, you get into a reality which you experience.
Somewhere on a turn.
Yet why does a person see? In fact, many people encounter that. The majority of people encounter this phenomenon.
Yes, they encountered it.
I would put it as follows. At least once in their lifetime, everyone encounters it. Why does this happen? A simple question.
Why?
Tanyusha, I like you. You answer a question with a question. Even though it seems you're not from Odessa, but you've surely been to Odessa.
Yes, I've been there.
Odessa has had an impact, friends.
I've gained experience.
Right, go to Odessa on vacation more and you will learn to communicate with people, as they say. So here's the answer. As a matter of fact, everything is very, very simple. We have consciousness. Every person's consciousness is individual, but it's a part of the whole system. If we speak in the terms of alternative ideologies, so to say, it is such a unified global consciousness, the universal mind,
The absolute,
yes, and the like. If we speak or call it in the language of religion, it is Satan. Well, demons are our consciousness. It is such a dark world or something else. It doesn't matter, it's the material world. Therefore, if consciousness controls us as personalities, then we live as pawns on the chessboard of the devil himself, let's put it so. And he plays us. He creates his sets and his games. Here, in a certain state, when a person is in a transitional state, he as personality can detect that. And this is called an effect of personality's awakening, meaning a déjà vu effect. Personality understands what is happening and sees it holistically. It perceives the whole picture already from an expanded perception as personality, and it knows what will happen a moment in advance. So does it look into the future or not? A simple question.
Yes, it turns out that it sees the scenario.
Right. It sees the scenario, it knows what will happen within a short period of time. Why were some people who possessed this skill able to foresee far ahead? Why did they predict something and it often coincided? Because they saw the scenario from the system itself.
But there were errors too.
Yet why do errors occur? Because those interfere whom the system doesn't see and cannot control. And it takes reverse steps. A simple example. For instance, 3 of us are standing and talking. 3 of us. Me, you, and our friend. So we are talking. And our friend has a déjà vu effect. He knows that a 4th person has to join us. If he doesn't do anything at this moment, the 4th person will join us and we will say exactly what our friend has seen. If he turns around and leaves, everything will change. The entire game will totally change, and the layout on the chessboard will be completely different. And the system is forced to spend energy and time on rearranging its game.
Yes, its route.
Absolutely right.
To lay it in you.
Right. Therefore, as long as we are subordinate to our consciousness, we cannot change either our destiny or anyone else's. But when we become free as personalities, we can change everything. We can... Well, if we go back to the creative society, I believe it's an important point to understand for people. We will be able to change that scenario which has been written for us. Why? Because we are actually people. And there is a part from the spiritual world in each of us. Meanwhile, excuse me, it is exactly the spiritual world that creates universes. Isn't that so? Thus we can do everything, friends, if we want to.
Igor Mikhailovich, I also wanted to ask the following question. You said that a person had lived through this déjà vu experience, so to say. He had it more than once, one way or another. Yet, why is it not beneficial to consciousness that a person would be in this state as often as possible?
Because a person begins to understand the illusory and artificial nature of this world. And since this world is artificial and illusory, that's firstly. Secondly, every such effect is a free breath for personality. But consciousness immediately begins to attack, embellish everything and lead everything into magic. A simple point. If we use this skill quite often, or all the more we make it controllable,
regular,
we will understand what magic is, what the three-dimensionality is, and what the spiritual world is. What will we choose? If we possess experience and knowledge, we will never trade the spiritual world for an illusion of this world, never. Well, that's not beneficial to the system.
And in this near-death state, which the physicist described in particular, it turns out that personality also gains freedom, doesn't it?
Yes, of course. In this case, personality gains freedom.
As well.
And he as personality can already control this process. He moves where he wants, thus he controls consciousness.
Does the connection go through the brain?
Connection? No, that's the whole effect. It goes through his brain already afterwards. While here,
directly,
a direct connection is generated. Moreover, without an intermediary. And why is the world different? It becomes different. A person perceives it in a different way. He has space limitations, tunneling, but it opens up. He's like in a tunnel, and this tunnel opens up all opportunities for him. A person may instantaneously be in any galaxy and on any planet, and see the reality and what he needs, again, if the effect of projection is used. Well, that's a special technique, but it still goes through tunneling. This tunnel opens up all the opportunities. And why is it exactly a tunnel? Here's a good question. Why does a human always perceive it in the form of a tunnel? Some neurophysiologists try to explain that this effect goes virtually from a neuron to a neuron. Well, that's not it. Our consciousness sort of moves. Our consciousness is not in the head. And those very neurophysiologists already understand very well that neurons perform a connecting function, but in no way they are a source of consciousness.
There is one more interesting point. You've said that our consciousness is not in the head, yet where is consciousness located and where is personality located, if we speak from the perspective of dimensions?
Well, if we speak in reality, in our understanding, for example, we are in the three-dimensionality with our brain, a bunch of neurons and all its functions. Our consciousness is in the fourth dimension, meaning one floor higher, whereas a human as personality is located between the sixth and the seventh dimensions. That is under the ceiling of the sixth dimension, so to say, not in the seventh one. He can get into the seventh dimension only together with the soul, but it's already an angelic being, not a human anymore.
Therefore, as you've said, it can be very difficult to reach out to personality.
Very difficult. Why? Because a human as personality doesn't perceive this world at all. He doesn't perceive the three-dimensional world. He cannot see it. So precisely these pictures, forms, bodies, everything, well, everything that we see in this three-dimensionality, we see it again thanks to the neural group of the brain, thanks to our eyes. We hear this sound thanks to our hearing apparatus and thanks to primary consciousness that transmits all these pictures to us. But who processes these pictures? Partially it is primary consciousness, but mostly it is secondary consciousness. Consciousness thinks this through. There is interaction between primary and secondary consciousness and ready information, the information which suits primary consciousness first of all, and in which the interest of secondary consciousness is sufficiently invested. This information already comes to us as personality, and we perceive it all. It's enough to disrupt a certain part of neurons, and we may not see it. Why? A certain function will be missing, although there is often compensation, and a more direct connection often occurs. It's enough for us to have, let's say, a certain number of neurons that would be responsible for the perception of vision and hearing so that an intermediary would work and we can basically communicate with this world in a normal way. After all, that often happens. Here's the answer to the question of why, when a larger part of the brain is missing, a person basically lives as he did before. Ancient structures are preserved, body functions, while new structures, that is, cortex and everything else, are partially present, and this is enough for communication.
Yes, now it at least becomes clear that when you said that in this near-death state people see those very images, it is clear why, for example, blind people who cannot see here in this world, when faced with a near-death experience, see images and hear sounds perfectly well.
Let's say, when a person who is blind from birth performs the practice of tunneling, he begins to see images in the same way as a sighted person. And he fully describes them, and it turns out for him that he has no experience of not seeing. He has the same experience as the sighted person. He sees the same way, he describes everything in the same way, and he visits everything in the same way. Where does he get this experience from? A simple question for those who doubt that such things are even possible. If our brain and our consciousness are individual, they do not interact with anyone and cannot get anything from the outside, except through learning and thinking, through experience. I mean what we see, hear, and perceive. Then, how did those images come into the head of a blind person? For example, a person blind from birth can describe an elephant by touching it. But can he really describe our planet? No, he cannot. He can associatively do it on something small, right? It's like...
Right.
We touch a globe. Imagine, enlarge, it's impossible. Those are purely associations. And why, when performing, let's say, the tunneling practice, a person who was born blind sees in the same way as a sighted person does? He sees and perceives that, and he fully describes it. Moreover, he manipulates it there, absolutely freely. After all, this is a fact. And what does this indicate? Even these facts themselves indicate that there is a world that we do not know, which is beyond our three-dimensionality. I mean, as science, we do not perceive it. Although again, this was known a very long time ago, even in modern times many experiments were conducted. 100 years ago and before that, experiments were conducted which confirmed it all. But it doesn't quite fit into the concept of modern science, which is kind of atheistic and a little bit limited, because in this case it would expand the understanding that there is something beyond our perception and it is completely different, because there is a monopoly in our world on what is beyond this perception. These are priestly organizations, and no one should enter there except them, whereas if someone enters there and starts telling the exact opposite of those fairy tales which they have made up, it turns out that these people destroy all the coherent concepts that have been feeding priestly organizations for thousands of years. Well, will they accept that? No. While this way we understand that priestly institutions have been established as an alternative to political institutions and have had tremendous power for centuries. Here's actually the answer to the question of why science was constrained by those very priests, and firmly constrained at that. Plus, they understood perfectly well and had the experience of the previous civilization. After all, the literature they obtained, starting from the first missions, is not a secret. Everyone knows that. They collected artifacts, literature, and everything else.
Yes, enormous libraries.
A lot was destroyed, and a lot of things were studied, and they gained a tremendous experience of knowing that there had been civilizations, far more than one, but this didn't fit into their concept. Imagine, if the truth was told, how would it be possible to establish an organization that would live off people and sell some spiritual stuff? In no way. Why? Because it immediately becomes clear that your spiritual path is your own achievement. There can be no mediator in it, just cannot be. Yet, if there is no mediator, then an organization, a priestly one, let's put it in a civilized way, which can exist at the expense of people performing the function of a mediator between God and a human, could not exist that way. Because what is their function then? None, because all merits and all achievements a person accomplishes by himself, right?
Right.
However, by including magic, by including substitutions, religious institutions are formed. Well, this has existed for a long time. Unfortunately, for the last, let's be precise, 5,000 years, almost 6,000 years.
Igor Mikhailovich, regarding substitutions on the spiritual path, many, especially in the modern world, there is such a point of view that spiritual development is a discovery of creative potential and life in flow. This state of flow, as people describe it in various professions, means that, again, you lose yourself, that you become a part of something greater, that there is also a change of time and space. For example, a composer's hand moves by itself and creates works, poets write poems. So, in fact, being in this kind of state is considered to be a marker of spiritual development, that a person can get there. And for many people, sometimes it's even kind of a peak of spiritual development, that it is. Maybe we should tell about this once again. What is this state of such a flow, and what does it have to do with spiritual development, if it has at all?
As a matter of fact, this has nothing to do with spiritual development. This is one of the effects when a person gets into flow. Well, what does flow mean? Flow is when a person feels movement and expansion of consciousness. It is practically the same as tunneling, but tunneling gives very serious functions and opportunities, and indeed it is very interesting. Let's say, for researchers, for people of science, it is very interesting for curious ones. And what does the sense of flow give? The sense of flow gives an expansion of consciousness and such a freedom of thinking, a feeling of flight. Well, an altered state of consciousness in which a person possesses a certain creative freedom.
Yes.
And this creative freedom gives a good writing style. You see, I would divide it this way. There are people who are, let's say, good at sciences,
Right.
mathematics, exact sciences, and there are people with a mentality more inclined towards literature, fantasy, well, towards creativity. There are practitioners, and there are people engaged in creative work. If the practice of tunneling is good for practitioners who are used to studying and creating something, then the effect of this flow, which gives that kind of freedom,
Expansion.
I would even say not just freedom, but an expansion of consciousness.
An altered state of consciousness.
Yes, but it is exactly in a creative search. It's more for creative people. Indeed, there are such things, such effects do occur. Actually, it's not difficult to generate them, and it has nothing to do with hypnosis or anything like that. You cannot induce such a state through hypnosis. It would be a surrogate state, and it quickly ends. While those are real states of consciousness expansion. A person has a different color perception, he perceives music differently. Let's say, it's when colors and music acquire some kind of
brightness, as they describe that, yes.
Oneness, I would even say.
Oneness, some kind of wholeness, yes.
Right, it becomes holistic and voluminous. All this is perceived in a different way. And then, of course, the creative potential of people expands. They can write beautiful music, which is dictated precisely by that freedom, and when you listen to it, it will also resonate in you. It's the same with artists and with masters of the word, when all this becomes easy for them. Yet this is again freedom of personality from consciousness, but no more. It's a short-term phenomenon as a rule. Maybe if this process is controlled, it can surely last for a long time, but anyway, a person has to come out of it. Anyway, all this is interrupted during sleep, and staying there for a long time is energy-consuming. But the point is that there are a lot of imitators of these people.
Yes.
They try to achieve this illusory freedom by using various chemical substances, for example, that very alcohol, absinthe, or those very drugs. They fall into sort of a prostration where it seems to them that they are free. They begin to create something, and there is a striking difference here. There are people who had this flow, they painted pictures, for example. You would stand in front of that painting and feel that freedom. Why? Because this is reflected on the canvas. Whereas if someone has been dabbing this picture for a couple of months under the influence of drugs or that very absinthe, it may look beautiful, but when you stand in front of that painting, you would feel all the fractured states of that person. Well, that's the way it is.
It is interesting that in the spiritual world there is this getting into the flow of love, being in the flow of love, and consciousness mirrors that.
Wait, this is not... There is no such a thing in the spiritual world. Such things exist in this world when you get into such a special, blissful state, very close to contact with the spiritual world.
Right.
This is what is present here. Why? Because you still feel this capsule of matter surrounding you. It still creates some discomfort, but inside you feel this oneness. Here, yes, it reveals, of course, but that's another thing. Those are different things.
While here, the system gives other states, after all, when artists...
As for artists, it's close to magic. It is still...
Yes, ecstasy, they say. At the moment, when they are painting, they feel a state of ecstasy given to them by the system.
Yes, it can be compared to such a supreme state of ecstasy, prolonged in time, with an effect of a visual, all-encompassing state of perception. Yes, but this is magic. It's a huge waste of attention on something that is inevitably dead. But when you perceive spiritually, you cannot express this on a canvas or in a musical composition, no. Yet what you perceive in spiritual contact actually gives you life. There is an essential difference.
Right.
You won't be able to use this spiritual experience to acquire material benefits here. It won't work. Whereas magic, all these flows, yes, it's possible. In order to make a name for yourself, it will be something appealing to people. Afterwards, that name may feed you. I mean, how it is nowadays. What are artists in our society? We've talked about this more than once.
A name.
First and foremost, it's a name, not the art that they produced. Let's say a kid draws the same thing Picasso drew. Just try to sell it for that money. Isn't that so?
Right. It's just also very interesting that, of course, scientists have figured out what contributes to finding or getting into this state of flow from the system. So it would be good if all these tools and skills were applied in a different direction, so that a person would concentrate as much as he wants to solve some material problem. He would concentrate on the inner state of love.
Wait, I disagree with you on this point. How can a person use the tunneling effect or the flow effects to concentrate on the inner state towards God? These are roads leading in the other direction.
Right.
You see, those are tools.
It's just that concentration of attention is involved to a great extent.
Those are trivial tools. They can be used on the path of serving the spiritual world so that a person would explore. He explores the arrangement of, let's say, what the other dimensions are, what the world of shadows is, what those very subpersonalities are. For that purpose, yes, in other words, he needs it as a tool he can use while serving the spiritual world. But he doesn't need dead tools to explore the spiritual world. This is where a life is needed. Direct contact is needed here, and there can be no intermediaries.
Yes, I agree. It's not enough to merely invest attention. It's important to have this inner life.
Of course.
I agree.
Well, attention. What is attention? Attention is a desire I want to have, right? Are you going to dictate? No, you cannot dictate to the spiritual world.
Right, you can only express your love.
People have megalomania, and they try to dictate and demand something from God. Since I'm here, it means I have some kind of a mission, so he's sitting all his life and waiting for someone to tell him about this mission. Meanwhile, his life has passed and he has done nothing. The very fact, since you are here, you already have a mission, so go ahead and accomplish it. However, you also want to get something in return, don't you? Bargaining with God. You cannot bargain with God. God is not Satan, you cannot get anything from him by begging. You can gain much more from God than Satan gives you.
Igor Mikhailovich, how can a person distinguish between true service to God and exploitation of God?
Wait, it's a good question. You see, what true service is
To God.
and what exploitation of God is.
Exploitation, how do they differ? How can
What is
one distinguish
exploitation
that?
of the spiritual world, exploitation of God? It is what all priestly organizations engage in. The whole world revolves around them. This is what ego is engaging on the spiritual path. They perceive the whole world as revolving around them. Everything must be for their beloved selves and nothing else. They see no one and nothing and measure everyone by their own yardstick. Absolutely everything revolves around them, right? Those are egoists. That's exploitation of the spiritual world. Even though they talk about God, about some love or something else, love for what? For themselves? Do they actually talk about love for God? They talk about how God loves them. This is trivial. It is such a kind of selfishness. It's an aspiration and desire for more and better for myself. They measure God's love and how much He loves them by how much they acquire out of that, right?
Yes, absolutely right.
Yet what is, let's say, it's not even service to the spiritual world, it's a natural, spiritual path. Service to the spiritual world is something entirely different. While those who are truly on the natural spiritual path measure differently. They measure this way: what can I do for people? How can I help the spiritual world to resist the attacks of consciousness on personality, even in someone? How much do I love God? Can I increase that love? He will never measure how much God loves him. He knows that. And he perceives that. Meanwhile here, excuse me, he never has enough on this path. A person always wants much more of God's love than he receives, especially in this three-dimensionality. Why? Because a humanist personality understands the boundlessness of that love, and he always wants more of it. And at this point a person begins to measure differently. What else can I do? And he never measures the world to fit him, let alone God's love to himself. No, he would do the opposite. What do I give? That's where the difference is, you see? I take and I give. That's where a huge difference and a watershed is between life and death. One path gives life, while the other gives an illusion of life until a person faces reality. And reality comes much sooner than one would like it to. When, in an instant, he becomes a subpersonality, he realizes the futility of his path and that he has been doing the wrong thing, although he has spent all his time, all his life, supposedly on serving God.
The material.
He was in a priestly organization
Rituals.
or something else. He constantly performed rituals. Or he was so pious that he was ready to crack anyone's head with a brick for God. Isn't that so? He spat on backs of non-believers and defended God.
Faith without love is fanaticism.
Right, including fanaticism too. So why does he become a subpersonality? Why does he not get to God? Because he measures everything to fit himself. Because he follows the path of an egoist. He gives nothing. Yet can you come to the spiritual world by considering what is given to you to be your own? You can't. And that's where a person clearly understands what is given so that you pass it on further. Is it really possible not to share the inner fire? What actually happens if fire has ignited in you and you do not share that fire? You yourself will either fade away or burn out. Isn't that so?
It is.
Whereas God's fire can, either burn you out or delight you. Isn't that so?
It is. Igor Mikhailovich, in the previous video, you very correctly said that the very meaning of a person's spiritual development is to share this inner fire with others, so that life in another person would increase, so that this life would multiply, and to carry this fire of grace further. This real, true, holy fire from soul to soul, from person to person.
That's where the very idea of the holy fire originated, right?
Right.
It is that fire which ignites in a person. It doesn't burn. And when you share it, it doesn't burn another person either.
Yes, the eternal fire, true fire.
The unquenchable fire. And that's the entire essence of human life, exactly to preserve this fire so that it doesn't go out. That's how it should be.
But alas, everything is distorted so much, and in the modern world on this subject also.
It all comes down to, everything comes down to magic, everything comes down to theatricality again. Even if we take the subject of the so-called holy fire which descends when it is supposedly lit, look, the truth has been turned into magic again. Isn't that so? And this magic has been imposed on the minds of millions of people. People are looking forward to this Saturday, whether the holy fire will descend or not, because a lot of believers were brainwashed by these priests. And this is really brainwashing when it is imposed on you that the holy fire ascends by the will of God, and from this fire, the priest, being in this cell, lights candles, brings it out to everyone and gives sort of a divine descent, and everyone is watching whether the fire descended quickly or not quickly.
They measure whether there will be the end of the world.
Yes, if God forbid the fire doesn't descend, that's it. There will be the end of the world. Well, that's nonsense and theatricality. Thank God today everything has already been proven. The same people who lit this fire told about it themselves, how it takes place. Filming was done in that cell, right?
Yes, at the Holy Sepulchre.
Pardon me, this theatricality begins right from the threshold in that place. Supposedly the priest who enters there is searched so that he has nothing he could light the fire from. But he enters and there are 2 icon lamps burning. So, from those lamps they actually light it. Well, everyone knows it already. But we keep believing in this fairy tale anyway. And there is an inextinguishable icon lamp there, which, by the way, Do you know where this originated from? When lamps were washed, put out, then lit. They were washed on that day. Well, it's sort of like washing these lamps. The inextinguishable fire should always be at Jesus' tomb according to their rules. You know, like eternal flame. Well, lamps are lamps. They burn, they should be cleaned and scoured. That's a natural process, and somehow it transformed into such theatricality. Later on, they started suggesting and telling people that God sends fire, it's a divine fire. And they say right away that the clergyman lights this fire, blesses it, and gives it to people. Guys, hasn't anyone over these hundreds of years come up with at least a logical question, how come a mortal human blesses the divine fire? Is a human superior to God? Isn't this what is happening? And what does the entire priesthood actually rest upon? That a human nearly excels God in some or other matters. It's a simple lie and deception, and it substitutes for that very essence, while in the past it was actually said and explained that the fire has to be inside you, and a lot was associated with this fire. However, everything goes into magic, as if magic leads anyone to heaven. Magic will lead everyone to grave, not to heaven.
You've said that a human wants to believe so much that God interferes in this three-dimensionality. A human, like a child, expects that...
Of course, he does expect. But everything is very simple here, let's say. There is such a need. Again, thanks to these very priestly institutions, they have imposed on people's mentality that God interferes, He watches you, you should be afraid of God, right? Fear of God? Why? Well, you should be afraid of God. That's a very convenient tool. By the way, it appeared not so long ago. As a matter of fact, previously, let's say, if we take Christianity, there was love for God, right? The first Christians, there were a lot of them, but later, when the priestly institution emerged as an organization, such a concept as fear of God appeared.
In the Middle Ages, there was a peak of this fear of God.
Of course, they began to impose it. Why? In order to strengthen the power of mediators, of organization itself. A simple example, a person looked askance or criticized a priest, and his cow died or his stable burned down. And he is immediately told, God punished you. And they tell others, look, he said a bad thing about a priest and his cow died. That's it. God punished him. And subconsciously, people have a fear of disobeying or even thinking badly of them. It's better not to think at all. And if to think, then only something good. After all, they are God's intermediaries. What they do, what they commit, well, that's actually... But they are human beings, they are sinful too. Well, they are kind of forgiven, they are intermediaries, they are representatives. If you think badly of them, that's it. It means it will be bad for you too. God will punish you. Thus, this kind of fear of God developed. Again, if you do not bring a tithe, or even better, you must sell everything and bring it. Once we already discussed it with you.
Yes.
The situation which Peter described. Boasting that a man sold everything, but kept something for himself, didn't bring everything to Peter, and that was it. God punished him, the man died. Well, it's again, why is this being done? Due to greed, stupidity, and a desire for domination. Isn't that so?
Yes, manipulation through fear.
Absolutely right. And how much magic, real magic, is introduced into all priestly institutions. After all, Jesus Christ said that God forbid that people practice magic. The prophet, peace be upon him, was against magic in general, and he said that there wouldn't be any magic. Why? Because magic leads to hell, to a state of subpersonality. Isn't it so? It is. Is it possible to come to God through magic or theatricality? No. The only way to God is through love. Jesus spoke about this, the last prophet spoke about this, and all true prophets who came before them spoke about this. But people need magic and people need power. What for? To master that power or somehow accumulate it and then dominate over others. I also like the expression introduced by priests, that if you listen to them and do what they want, supposedly what God says, you'll be a king or a priest for 1,000 years in heaven. That's a fine expression.
That there will be a new heavenly government in the future.
Of course, certainly.
Where you and Christ will rule together.
Yes, you will rule together with Christ, yes. You will be like a king or a priest. Again, where did that come from and in what way? And what does it give? What kind of a mindset does it give to a person? That you'll be a priest, so a priest is a king-like being.
Parallels are drawn in consciousness.
Of course. These are assertions. Again, isn't this brainwashing? Isn't this manipulation? Excuse me, over the primitive human brain? Well, of course. What can we talk about here? Goodness. Yet, do they actually talk about the true fire that should burn in a human? The fire that is generated by love for God, which should be shared, and it is from this fire that extinct candles should be lit. Isn't it so? Or unlit candles, but if you don't cherish it, it will go out in you. If you don't share it, it will smolder in you, but it will never ignite with the true flame. Right?
Because they themselves, those priests and sometimes such false prophets too, do not know what the real true fire is.
How would they know that?
They do not have this practice. And by the way, this is what the prophet talked about when he said that you call out to them besides Allah, but they themselves are slaves, the same as you are. And they cannot help you because they cannot even help themselves. In the same way, it was said in Christianity that they themselves supposedly were slaves of corruption, that they were unfree people.
Slaves of corruption. That's the point. They are not the source of fire. Only God is the source of fire. Whereas when we choose a mortal one for ourselves and invest our attention in Him, when we trust Him and listen to Him, instead of listening to God in order to accumulate this power in ourselves, we get what we get. Again, were those same states of subpersonality not mentioned?
Right.
They were. And what was invented afterwards? Did Jesus Christ or the prophet tell people that there would be such and such hell precisely this way, with cauldrons, some devils, or something else, those fairy tales? Of course not. They talked about what was real, yes, a little bit allegorically, explaining to people what subpersonality is, that each of your sins you will watch in your head 1,000,000,000 times and keep living through it every day. Your conscience will torment you, and you will burn in fire. In what kind of fire? In the fire that gives life. If you haven't gained life in this fire of love here, then it will be a fire of punishment for you.
This is a very important understanding, Igor Mikhailovich, that a person will really rewatch and repeatedly live through each of his lifetime scenes billions of times.
Here's a simple piece of advice, friends. You do know. Each of you knows when you do bad things, when you commit deeds, you feel it all. Just stop. Remember a simple truth. When you do bad things to someone, as they say, you commit a sin, you think badly, act badly, not the way you should. Remember that if you don't stop and don't change it right now when you can change it, then if you don't gain life later but become a subpersonality, billions of times you will live through it and think that you could correct it but didn't do that. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to torture your own conscience and torment yourself billions of times over many centuries in order to live through the deed you commit? It is better to stop this evil immediately. You do see and understand. Why do you do that? Everything is simple, very simple, and prophets talked very simply. They told that what anyone can comprehend, because there is nothing easier to gain life. There is nothing complicated about it. Later on, of course, they made it more complicated and turned it into a whole science. What science is in love? Simply love. Isn't that right?
But thank God, these grains of knowledge exist.
For thousands of years, those very priests have been trying to bury these grains of knowledge, but they forgot that these are grains, and when they are buried, they sprout.
You know, that very Saint Basil the Great, he lived in the 4th century, said regarding the state of subpersonality that the shame
Of course,
for the sins
you've committed.
you've committed will be worse than this fire which burns you out. You will see them all the time. They will be like irremovable paint constantly in front of a person.
Certainly. Where will they disappear? You will actually... The whole function of subpersonality is to live through the life you've had, because life is one. You will live through it billions of times, every day, every moment. You will see and understand all the mistakes you've made and the opportunities you've missed. But this, you know, I'll say, even our words are not perceived by people. Why? Because people's consciousness is so much brainwashed indeed. People live for other things, they are preoccupied with something else. And another trouble is that people have no experience, they do not know about the existence of the other world. Naturally, they do not know about the existence of the spiritual world, they do not have this experience and don't have any practice. They have nothing to choose from. So of course it would be good to bring in some knowledge or understanding so that people can start gaining this freedom.
As it is said in the comments to Bhagavad Gita, true knowledge is the knowledge that shows the real difference between spirit and matter,
Of course.
while the knowledge that we have in the world merely relates to the category of ignorance. It is just some information about how to live in this world, but it's not true knowledge.
We have a lot of knowledge, but our knowledge, which is in the world, doesn't give a person that ability
This understanding, right?
and that understanding, which would enable him to separate the spiritual from the material. Unfortunately, knowledge that we gain is the knowledge that relates to three-dimensionality. How to build something, how to do something, how to deceive someone or something else. All this is nonsense that passes very quickly.
Yes.
Just like human life itself. While true knowledge leads to life eternal. That's where, of course, it would be good to have at least some proof, at least some help, but at this point a problem arises. Why? Because even our consciousness is in the 4th dimension. Well, in order to study something that is one level higher, let's say in the 4th or 5th dimension, The tool that we use to observe or study should also be in that dimension. We don't have such tools in our world.
So a recorder must be of the same nature as the object of study.
Certainly, of course. Well, how can you study, let's say, the fourth dimension by means of three-dimensional devices? In no way. I'm speaking figuratively, but thank God we have consciousness. Our consciousness is in the fourth dimension. If it is trained enough, it has a function to penetrate up to the sixth dimension, consciously at that. And this process can be controlled. There are also beings that do not live in three-dimensionality, but they can also manifest themselves in three-dimensionality. These are so-called shadows and many others. We actually have a huge ocean of life that is located not only in three-dimensionality, but also one level higher, right? Sometimes it is 2 or 3 levels higher. So by studying that, but so that it would be reflected here, at least indirectly, we can achieve something. Thanks to what tool can we study that? Thanks to consciousness, because it is precisely the recorder located in the next dimension, meaning in a higher dimension, right?
Right, but the observer should also be from the perspective of the spiritual.
There should be the observer anyway. The observer, in this case, will be
Higher.
in the highest state of the material world, I mean. It will be near the ceiling of the sixth dimension. This is also very important. But it's an individual experience. That's where one should work oneself. Will people really want to invest effort, time and attention in that? No. If it is curious or interesting, they can look at something there. Well, you should spend your time and effort consciously. You should understand what you're doing. But if a person doesn't even understand that God exists and doesn't understand what awaits him after death, he doesn't want to understand that. Why? Well, it's enough if someone tells him, go and light the candle and you will be in heaven, or they will pray for you. The inclination to shift responsibility onto someone else, even for your own destiny, is so deep in us. For thousands of years we have been brainwashed, so it's natural that we have forgotten all this, we have missed it, and we no longer know. That's a trouble, of course.
You've correctly said that a person in the modern world is sort of deprived of this choice.
Deprived.
He doesn't understand what to choose between.
I'd like to say that there is a chance now, and it is very interesting. It is possible to make a project which, at least indirectly, will show the reality of the existence of the other world. Well, I can clarify, an idea was born to launch quite an interesting and necessary project, well, and whether our friends will consider and want it, because this project will be done by them and not by us. All our friends remember the pyramid project, don't you? What is the pyramid? The pyramid, the one we made, is designed similar to the human energy structure itself. There are 11 tori in it, which influence those energy centers that can be strengthened or weakened. In other words, it's a tool for manipulating our energy body, which makes it possible to bring our consciousness to one level or another. So, quite recently, while studying the pyramid itself, how it works, we came across a very interesting point. It is that by using certain settings on the 9 tori at a certain frequency, well, it actually doesn't matter. Using these settings, our operator, again, the operator in this case, is professional and well-trained, who has been working for a long time. So the operator managed to establish an information exchange with dead people, I mean with subpersonalities, with active subpersonalities.
In himself or not in himself?
The point is exactly that not in himself. In himself, that's not difficult. Let's say by means of hypnosis or certain practices, if there is an active subpersonality in a person,
to activate it.
It can be activated. Well, it substitutes. It turns out that subpersonality substitutes for secondary consciousness and you can converse. These facts have been verified a long time ago. But the point is that hardly everyone has an active subpersonality. And again, all this is individual and a hypnosis technique is used in that case. While in this project that we think about, here on the contrary, we need people resistant to unconscious suggestions, including auto-hypnosis. I mean people who possess a certain spiritual skill, who can differentiate what is imposed by consciousness, those illusions which come to them, as personalities, who understand and can distinguish where there is a fantasy and where there is a reality. It's like you and I discussed when a person performs a mental astral projection, right?
Right.
99.9% are fantasists, but there are really people who indeed practice, and the difference there is huge. Everything is immediately seen, where a fantasy is and where there is reality. So, let's return to our operator and to this project. We managed to adjust the settings precisely in such a way that the frequency of interaction coincides and a certain resonance with active subpersonalities arises, that is, on the wave where they function. It is still only one dimension higher, let's say, even several dimensions to be precise. Active subpersonalities are in the fourth dimension, less active are in the fifth. It doesn't matter, but the person is already able to restore contact. What was the idea? We set a simple goal and task in order to make it evidential, so that the operator would find in that flow subpersonalities who recently died. While there are a lot of them, and even there are many active ones, after all, this is quite evidential. You see, after a couple of such detections, we recorded the data because there is an information exchange with the subpersonality. Guys try to maintain contact with relatives as if on behalf of their deceased, but it was surely adventurous. It almost got to police involvement. Well, I understand. Firstly, again, the information was conveyed to the relatives extremely carelessly, and they perceived it
Directly.
directly, absolutely directly, yes, without any
Filters.
preparation or explanation. Relatives were shocked, some of them were already about to go to the police. Well, basically everything ended as usual. Caution is paramount in conveying information. Well, at least we have ascertained the authenticity of information. The contact is really established, and so on. We have worked a little bit further. First of all, what does this project give? What kind of opportunities? These are opportunities. Let's say it is evident that a human,
The other world exists, yes.
of course,
That these personalities exist there.
and what state they are in. Information goes directly from subpersonalities themselves. I mean, they describe their state and it's like a gulp of air for them. Clearly, energy is spent. The operator himself invests his attention too, but in this case, thanks to the pyramid design itself, all this is compensated, yet it gives an opportunity to explore and study that world, at least somehow. At the same time, this is interesting to subpersonalities as well. They can even contact their relatives through intermediaries. This is very interesting, in fact. And it proves the existence of the other world. Why? Because it's a random selection and everything depends on the activeness of subpersonality itself, on its personality. What else does it give? An opportunity of energy exchange with some shadows. These are different creatures that possess intelligence. Plus, it's an opportunity to easily perceive and see those very conduits. This is really interesting, important and necessary. Moreover, it is possible to find them, like through GPS, so to say, up to a point where they are. This is also quite promising, although it's not today's task, let's just say. As of today, there are a lot of projects, including that very creative society, which are of top priority. This project cannot consume a lot of our attention and effort. Why? Because there are projects of primary importance, without which these projects simply become pointless. If we do not implement the Creative Society project the way it should be implemented, very soon nobody will need all this information. I put it kind of carefully. Therefore, everyone understands perfectly well that, well, if the Creative Society project is implemented, this information will be extremely necessary and important for people. This may be developed in parallel.
A good chance to demonstrate that to people.
A very good chance. But the thing is that our research group, including the professional operator, so to say, they have a lot to do. It was a side effect that we have spent some time on. We saw that it worked, and it's really interesting, and through this, it's indeed possible, if we approach it in the right way, it will be quite evidential to explain to a lot of people what actually exists beyond our perception or what happens to a human after death. It is clear that you won't get in touch with someone who has departed to heaven, but you can exchange information quite accurately with those who are in the state of subpersonality or in hell. The latest incident with relatives precisely showed that what subpersonality knows could only be known to that dead person. That's why it was a key point in negotiations and didn't reach the police. And later on they reacted quite adequately. Although people were in shock, such things are also quite striking. So it's necessary to be extremely careful with that. Why do I say extremely careful? Because if we develop this project, it should be developed, let's say, by our participants, our friends and fellows, those who are willing. Several teams should be gathered. There has to be a team of researchers, and there has to be a team of operators. Why? Because not everyone can be admitted as operators. Not everyone who desires can perform that. Consciousness still dictates to many people. Many will diverge into hallucinations from consciousness. I mean those very auto-hypnosis or something else. They will be confused. Here we need unbiased operators who can freely differentiate what consciousness tries to suggest to them, or whether it's a real contact. It is felt, it is understandable, but it's impossible to convey this experience, it has to be earned, so all this requires time, plus there are precise settings, 9 tori in fact, while a professional operator works in a wide range. Here, more accurate settings are needed for each operator individually. The main thing is that we know approximately which settings to use, where to adjust, and how to work on that. So we will certainly hand them over and describe that, but afterwards is the work of people, and in order to actually... This is just my opinion, friends, I'll express it, and then you will see for yourselves. Those who want to work in this field, who are interested in it, should first of all understand that it will take years. It won't take 2 or 3 days, as they say. Years are really needed for that. It has to be organized in the right way. A team has to be gathered which will indeed be able to work long and tediously. But it's interesting. It is interesting in prospect. How this relates to the research group as well as to the operators and many other things. A lot of things should be thought over. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and everyone else should be involved. In other words, the entire process has to be organized in the right way from the very beginning. And there has to be research, certain algorithms should be developed and followed. Moreover, in order to make it unbiased, I believe there has to be an online broadcast, not just recording, but online broadcast. Let it be sort of a show. Let it be a show.
Sort of a response to skeptics.
Well, it's not just a response to skeptics, it's not skeptics who need it, first and foremost. Forget skeptics. They have chosen their life. Well, this is necessary for those who search, who are on the path, whom consciousness badly trolls, not letting them breathe, but they feel something different. This information is needed for personal victories, and in general, it is needed so that people could finally gain a choice, so that they know that such things exist. I believe it's the best evidence. Yes, we cannot pull subpersonality into 3-dimensionality and show, here it is, but we can maintain information exchange. Well, information exchange gives a lot, however, there is a danger here too, my friends. Those who are willing, after all, when entering an information exchange with subpersonality, an operator practically obtains all the information, the entire experience from subpersonality. There are nuances here too, especially those who, in any case, I very well understand and know what a human is. There will be a desire to come into contact with kanduks,
with active ones,
and with active subpersonalities, while the first ones you can contact are only active subpersonalities. It's extremely difficult to contact passive ones, because it is more, tuning is subtler, and it is actually more energy consuming. While active ones have a certain power, there are a lot of nuances here.
And also magic knowledge.
Absolutely right. I just wanted to delicately approach this and explain that it borders on magic. It is also dangerous for operators. An unstable position of an operator himself as personality may lead him into magic. In other words, a person really risks. He risks his future. Therefore, this should be approached seriously. While selecting operators too, and operators themselves should understand that they can, like Tesla, trade the spiritual for fame and actually acquire poverty and a bunch of problems. Yes, you will gain fame, but the main thing is what you will get later, after your life, whereas life is very short. But you can help as well, you can help a lot of people if you succeed with this project. First of all, if you undertake it, because I emphasize once again, it has to be taken and organized from scratch. And again, it means developing all this from scratch up to a final result. But if you succeed in organizing and doing everything properly, you will be able to evidentially prove the existence of the otherworldly existence of subpersonality. You cannot call it life anymore. It is what a person can arrive at if he chooses ordinary life, the life of an ordinary human, let's say.
Is it possible to participate in this project remotely?
No. There are nuances here. It will be possible to participate in it remotely, I think, like in an analytical project or something like that.
Partially.
Sort of partially, yes. In general, both the research group and the operators have to be here because the pyramid itself is used. Well, thanks to this project, we understood, again, that the pyramid's capabilities are extremely limited. Really limited. As of today, we already understand that a different device is needed. 112 tori are needed at least. And the structure has to be much bigger and more serious. Well, these are already matters of the distant future. Today there are too many projects that should be implemented and they are of top priority. This one is already secondary. Although we would reveal things better, let's say, if we had not the pyramidal device with 11 tori, but a slightly more complex and more serious device. The work would be much simpler. We already understand this now.
In other words, the tool of learning is human consciousness, while the function of the pyramid, which is in three-dimensionality, is just to tune.
This is merely... its function is to tune. It merely creates conditions. We have to understand how this world is arranged, how we can create conditions for our consciousness to tune to perceiving that information. This merely creates conditions. Be it the pyramid, or if we even create a more sophisticated device, it will still merely create conditions, while the research tool will be our consciousness anyway, only through it. Why? Because it is located higher. We cannot move this whole device into the fourth or fifth, let alone the sixth dimension. It's impossible. You see, we've started talking about dimensions, and how is that perceived by people as an increase in geometric complexity? Isn't that so? It is. How do we perceive what the first dimension is? It's a point, right?
Yes.
Where is that point? In three-dimensionality. What is the second dimension in our view? We have a stripe here. A two-dimensional drawing.
Right.
That's two-dimensionality for us, right? But where are we looking at it? In three-dimensionality. Three-dimensionality is already, excuse me.
Another axis of coordinates was added.
Yes, one axis of coordinates was added. What is the fourth dimension? They add one more.
They added more complexity.
Axis of coordinates, yes, sort of geometry becomes more complex, while in fact, it is something completely different. If you look from that perspective, three-dimensionality already turns into, even from the perspective of the fourth dimension, it becomes completely distorted. It's no longer that three-dimensionality which we perceive, and the density of material that we see is no longer the same. In fact, macro objects like us or something else are no longer perceived. All this is already perceived in a different way, and in the sixth dimension you no longer see anything at all, any material structure whatsoever. But again, we say that, but it all has to be proven. This is just philosophy and talk. If we cannot bring it into three-dimensionality, describe and show it, then from a scientific point of view, this doesn't exist.
There is a chance to study.
But in order to study this, we need to make a more sophisticated and complex device, so that we can use our consciousness as a tool and prove through it. But then again, if it's all online, if there are a lot of operators, a lot of evidence-based experiments are conducted, even at the information level. Here's a simple example. A person dies somewhere, however, a contact and information exchange with him takes place. And he himself, that is, the subpersonality itself, confirms what is confirmed by his relatives and friends, hence it's already a fact, isn't it? But we can think of some other proof. Yet it is surely impossible to bring him here and show him. In other words, it's impossible to bring something that exists in the fourth or fifth dimension into three-dimensionality. That's unrealistic.
I see.
That's a problem, of course. That's why no one has come from there. But in any case, today we can Already, you know, like in fairy tales.
Establish contact.
Establish contact, yes. There were ancient Greek myths when people descended into that world.
Actually, yes.
Yes, it's interesting.
Yes, the other world.
So the way is open for such heroes.
Kind of online communication with the other world.
Right, online communication with the other world. Isn't it interesting, friends? It is interesting. Well, if there are heroes, we can organize this.
Igor Mikhailovich, you said that there is a danger from a perspective that a person encounters knowledge which
Of course.
can lead him astray to take a slippery slope.
Easily at that.
Are there any other dangers from a subpersonality to a human? I'm just going to voice a widespread point of view now. Many people think that no danger should be expected from them whatsoever, because as soon as a person...
From whom? From the dead?
From the dead, yes. Because as soon as this earthly life is over, as soon as they die, they become
harmless.
Powerless, yes. In other words, they lose their power and cannot harm a human being in any way.
Well, there's an expression that you should be afraid of the living rather than the dead, right?
Right.
Because the dead can no longer harm you in any way. However, if we get to the root of it, and even proceeding from the understanding we have today, the dead ones harm the living much more than the living do. The living complicate our lives. If the living do not take our lives directly, all they can do is complicate our lives. As for true life, eternal life, it is often the dead or the others who deprive us of it, by interfering in our consciousness directly. And it is true, by taking away our life, meaning by taking away our attention, by taking away our energy. That's what is scary. In fact, all living people fight for our attention too, and we fight for the attention of others all the time. This is really so. The most valuable thing is attention.
Attention.
At one time, you and I already discussed this topic. Maybe someday we will talk more about the power of attention, its influence, and what is actually concealed behind that. Although we've already explained a lot about it, let's say the smart ones will understand anyway, while those who do not want to actually don't need this, right? Therefore, it's not all that simple. One has to be much more careful with the dead than with the living. What is good about this project is that, if implemented, it can draw a line under this issue and ensure that the dead would not interfere with the lives of the living and would not take away their lives. I think this is also very important. Well, from now on, my friends, the future of this project already depends on you. You will implement it if you want to. No matter how interesting it is, we cannot afford it. As of today, there are more important projects that, let's say, the professional operators and the professional researchers should deal with. There are more important things, unfortunately. Although this project is also very significant, I consider it to be a very important point. It is actually interesting, it is curious even for consciousness in a way, but at the same time it is very important.
Yes, because in fact, a human knows virtually nothing about that world and about death.
Yes, you know, I'll put it simply. In fact, the most unexplored object is a human. We know a lot about space. We don't know enough, but we already know quite a lot about our planet, about the ocean. However, if we leave out the physiology of our bodies, we know virtually nothing about a human. In the field of psychology and psychiatry, there are banal, stereotypical understandings, nothing more. Yet, what is actually a human being as a structure? After all, we are very complex. This needs to be studied. And it needs to be studied without bias, but you know how it is. In science nowadays, unfortunately, if you encounter something that doesn't fit into an established paradigm, that means it's impossible. Why? Because it cannot be so, but it exists, doesn't it? No, it's impossible, and that's it. Forget it. Isn't that so? Although in the past people encountered and studied this, literally 100 years ago. After all, there were works in this direction, quite interesting at that, but then it all stopped. Why? Because it intertwined with a little bit different physics, not the one that should, and allowed to be studied, and many other things. In short, one thing led to another.
Igor Mikhailovich, how can a person who encounters information about the other world, about that world, avoid the fear of death?
He should gain life. A person can get rid of the fear of death only when he gains life eternal. Otherwise, the fear of death will be present, there is no escaping it. Despite his swagger, it will be there anyway. Again, the fear of death is also a manipulation from consciousness. It's a very strong and powerful argument for personality. Well, again, personality perceives the world differently, and it knows much more than we even realize. We do not reveal ourselves here. In fact, on the spiritual path, we kind of rediscover a lot of things. We sort of recall them. That's why it was said to recall and not to acquire a skill. You just need to recall it. In fact, you really need to recall, because the experience is actually inherent. Again, it may be a reflection from the soul, but it's a skill from that world. And in that world, there is everything. There is totality of comprehension and knowledge there. It's not all that simple. It's complex, although there is nothing complicated about it either. Is it difficult to comprehend life? No. One should just learn to love. Right? And what is the most important thing? To learn to love each other. So, friends, let us probably finish our conversation at this point. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. But if it's about the project, don't ask me. You know the address, you know whom to ask. Let the guys help and give information about the project for those who are interested. So, friends, let's just start with a simple thing. To love God the best we can, and to love each other the best we can. The main thing is to do our best, the main thing is to start, and everything will work out, right?
To increase life in oneself and in another person.
Exactly, so friends, let's make sure that our inner fire never goes out, but on the contrary flares up, and that we can share it with others, right? Let's love each other. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.